Every great voice has a story behind it that the world never fully hears. Not the story of the talent, that part gets told, repeated, mythologized until it hardens into legend and loses the human shape it had when it was still becoming. The story that goes untold is the other one, the one about the person standing just off to the side, out of the frame, doing the invisible work that makes the visible work possible, clearing the path, holding the structure. Making the decisions that never appear in the official record because the official record is only interested in the person standing at the microphone, and the person standing at the microphone is only possible because of what is happening in the room adjacent. In the summer of 1971, John Lennon lost his voice, not metaphorically, not creatively, literally the instrument that had carried his words to hundreds of millions of people, that had delivered twist and shout and imagine and give peace a chance, and everything in between went silent. 3 days during which he could not produce more than a hoarse whisper, during which the recording sessions for what would become one of the most important albums of his career were suspended, during which the machinery of the music industry, the producers and the label representatives and the managers and the engineers with their schedules and their deadlines, pressed at the studio doors with the particular urgency of people whose livelihoods are attached to a clock that does not stop running because a human being is unwell. Yoko Ono did not let them in. For 3 days she managed everything: the phone calls, the rescheduling, the careful, firm communications to people who were accustomed to getting what they wanted and who had very particular opinions about whose voice was important in the room. She did this without announcing that she was doing it, without issuing a statement, without asking for recognition. She simply stood between John and the machinery and absorbed the pressure so that he did not have to, and when his voice came back, when the 3 days were over and he could speak again and the sessions resumed, the record that resulted would become one of the defining artistic statements of the decade. That record was Imagine, but the story of Imagine, the story the world knows, does not include Yoko. It rarely has. The story the world knows is the story of John at the white piano, writing the melody in 20 minutes, converting his idealism and his grief and his generation's hunger for something better into 3 minutes of music so simple and so true that it has never stopped playing. That story is real, and it is incomplete. This is the part that was left out. Yoko Ono was born on February 18, 1933, in Tokyo, Japan, into a family of wealth and culture and the particular complexity of a Japan that was modernizing rapidly while remaining deeply traditional in ways that created friction for anyone who did not fit cleanly into its expectations. She did not fit. She had never fit. Her father, Yoko Ono, was a banker and classical pianist, a man of considerable accomplishment and considerable emotional distance, the kind of father who provided everything material and withheld everything intimate in the way that the cultural codes of his generation required. Her mother, Isoko Yasuda, came from one of Japan's most powerful banking families, a world of obligation and propriety and the specific burden of a name that demanded a particular kind of behavior in exchange for the privileges it conferred. Yoko grew up inside that world and against it simultaneously. She was sent to the Gakushuin school in Tokyo, the peers' school, where the Japanese imperial family educated their children, and she was the first girl admitted to the philosophy department of Gakushuin University, which says something about her intellectual capacity and something about how early she had learned to enter rooms that were not expecting her and remain in them regardless. The family moved to New York in the early 1950s. Yoko attended Sarah Lawrence College, studying music and poetry and the intersections between them, and then left without completing her degree because the formal academic structure was too slow and too narrow for what she was already thinking and making. She moved to Lower Manhattan. She found the avant-garde art world that was happening in lofts and galleries and the spaces between established institutions, found the people who were asking different questions about what art was for and what it could do, and where the boundary was between art and life, and whether that boundary needed to exist at all. She made work that the mainstream art world was not prepared for and did not receive kindly. Instruction pieces, small, poetic prompts that ask the reader or viewer or participant to imagine something, to do something, to engage with the world differently than they had before. Conceptual work that lived in the gap between intention and action, between the piece and the experience of it. Grapefruit, the book she published in 1964, collected these instruction pieces in a form that was both art object and philosophical argument. A declaration that the imagination was itself a medium, that the act of imagining was as real as any canvas or sculpture or 3-minute song played on a white piano in a white room. The art world noticed her and did not know what to do with her. She was too early, too unclassifiable, too unwilling to be contained within the categories that the art world needed her to occupy in order to evaluate her properly. She was reviewed inconsistently and condescendingly, and sometimes not at all. She persisted with the specific stubbornness of someone who has learned, through long experience, that the absence of recognition is not the same as the absence of value. She was 33 years old when she met John Lennon. She had been making important work for a decade. She had built a life and an artistic practice from scratch in a city and a culture that had no ready place. For her, she had done this without the apparatus of fame, without the validation of a major institution, without the particular confidence that comes from a world that tells you consistently and loudly that what you are doing matters. She had done it anyway, because the work mattered to her, and because she had long since learned that the absence of the world's recognition did not change the truth of what she knew. That quality, the absolute, unperformable certainty of someone who has never needed external validation to continue, was the thing John Lennon encountered at the Indica Gallery in November 1966 and recognized immediately as something he had not encountered before. He had been surrounded his entire adult life by people who wanted things from him: his music, his image, his endorsement, his presence. Here was someone who wanted none of those things, who engaged with his ideas rather than his celebrity, who pushed back when she disagreed and did not soften the pushback to protect his feelings. He was not accustomed to being seen clearly. It was, by his own account, the most unsettling and the most necessary thing that had ever happened to him. And it was the thing that would save his voice in the summer of 1971, when everything else was pressing him toward dissolution. John Lennon arrived in New York in September 1971, carrying the particular energy of someone who has just completed something enormous and is not yet certain what comes next. The Beatles were over. Imagine the album was being recorded at Tittenhurst Park and at Record Plant in New York. The songs were coming from somewhere different than his earlier work, warmer, more direct, less armored. The public John Lennon was still very much present. The interviews, the activism, the positions taken on everything from Vietnam to prison reform to the specific political currents of the moment. But something in the music had shifted, and the shift had Yoko's fingerprints all over it, even when her name was not attached. She had been talking to him for years, talking and arguing and challenging and expanding, in the way that only someone who genuinely engages with another person's ideas rather than simply receiving them can do. Her Grapefruit book had influenced the Imagine album more directly than any official account had acknowledged. The instruction piece format, the simple, direct invitation to imagine, was the structural DNA of the album's title track, a fact that John himself admitted in later interviews with more honesty than he had shown at the time of recording. But in the summer of 1971, the question was not attribution. The question was completion. The sessions were complicated. John was working with Phil Spector, a producer of enormous talent and considerable personal difficulty, whose methods generated both extraordinary results and considerable friction. The schedule was demanding, the material was ambitious. And John was operating under the accumulated pressure of everything that had converged on him in the preceding 2 years. The Beatles' dissolution and its legal aftermath, the deportation proceedings initiated by the Nixon administration, the constant surveillance that he had become aware of, the public hostility directed at Yoko that required constant management and constant response. He was tired in a way that the recording sessions were not designed to accommodate. And then in the middle of it all, his voice went. It was not dramatic. It did not happen in the studio mid-take with a room full of witnesses. It happened overnight, the way these things happen. He went to sleep with a throat that was slightly raw from overuse and overwork and the dry air of the recording environment, and he woke up with nothing. A hoarse whisper at most, not enough to record, not enough to sustain the sessions. What Yoko did in the 3 days that followed has never been the subject of any significant public documentation, which is itself a form of erasure. The invisibility of the work that holds everything else together is the most reliable feature of that work, because if it were visible, it would not be doing what it needs to do. What is known from the accounts of people who were present at the edges of those days is this. She called Phil Spector and told him the sessions were suspended. Spector, who did not like being told things were suspended, pushed back. Yoko held the position without escalating, which is a more difficult skill than it sounds. The ability to maintain a boundary against someone who is accustomed to having boundaries removed is not a skill that can be improvised in the moment. It requires the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and why. She called the label. She managed the communications that John, with no voice and the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the physical, was in no position to manage. She arranged for people to be told what they needed to be told and not more. She created the space, 3 days of it, unmarked, unscheduled, not appearing in any official record as anything other than a gap in the session notes, in which John could simply be quiet, not perform. Quiet, not manage quiet, just be it. She brought him tea. She made sure he slept. She sat in rooms with him without requiring anything of him, which is a form of love that is very specific and very rare, the ability to be present without demanding that the other person perform their recovery for your reassurance. John did not speak for 3 days, he wrote. He sat at the piano in the White Room at Tittenhurst Park and played quietly, without recording, without agenda, without the machinery of the album running around him. He read. He slept more than he had slept in months, and something that had been depleted, not just his voice but the thing behind his voice, the source from which the voice drew its content, began to replenish. But there was something no one in those quiet rooms could fully see, not even Yoko. The replenishment was happening at a depth that would only become apparent in what came out of the sessions when they resumed, in the particular quality of the imagined vocal take, the specific vulnerability and certainty in his voice on the recording that has never been replicated, not by him and not by anyone else, in any of the hundreds of versions that have been made since. On the 4th day, John's voice came back. Not completely, it had the slightly raw, slightly worn quality that voices have after a period of forced rest, the texture of something that has been through something and is coming out the other side. Phil Spector, when he heard it in the studio, said it was perfect, that the texture was what the song needed, that the slight roughness in the upper register was not a deficiency but a truth, the sound of a human voice that has been used to say real things and carries the evidence of that use in its grain. He was right. The imagined vocal that exists on the recording, the one that billions of people have heard in the 50-plus years since, has a quality that is impossible to manufacture deliberately. It is the quality of something that has been arrived at rather than produced, that comes from a specific human experience of specific days rather than from technique alone. The voice on that recording is the voice of a man who has been quiet for 3 days and is coming back from the quiet with something to say. Yoko created those 3 days. That is not a small thing. That is arguably the most important contribution to the making of Imagine that no one talks about. More important than the production, more important than the arrangements, more important than the specific chord sequence or the choice of key or any of the other technical decisions that have been analyzed and documented and written about at length. She gave him the silence from which the song emerged with its full power intact. The world's reception of Yoko Ono has been one of the more sustained exercises in collective misunderstanding that popular culture has produced in the modern era. She was blamed from almost the moment she appeared in John's life, for things she had not done and things that were not her fault and things that would have happened regardless of her presence. The Beatles would have ended without her. The tensions that produced the dissolution were structural and personal and had been building for years, and any honest account of the band's final period makes this clear. She did not break up the Beatles. She arrived as they were breaking, and because she was there, because she was visible and foreign and unconventional and deeply attached to John in ways that excluded others, she became the available explanation for a complex of causes that resisted simple explanation. She bore the hostility with the same quality she had brought to everything else, steadily, without performing equanimity, simply continuing to do the work. She made art. She raised Sean after John's death with a fidelity and a devotion that produced, in Sean Lennon, a person of considerable creative and personal integrity. She maintained the archive of John's work with a care that has made it possible for generations who never heard him perform to encounter what he made. She advocated for the causes he believed in, peace above all, always peace, with a consistency that has not wavered across more than 4 decades. She did all of this while being in the public imagination, primarily a symbol of interference and disruption. The gap between what she actually did and what the world decided she was represents one of the more remarkable distortions in the history of how women in the orbit of famous men are perceived and recorded. John knew this. He said so, repeatedly and directly, with the characteristic willingness to state uncomfortable truths that defined his public voice. He said that Yoko was the most important person in his life, that their relationship was the foundation on which everything he had done since 1966 had been built, that the hostility directed at her was rooted in things that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the people doing the directing. He was right. He said it. The world heard it and continued largely to believe what it preferred to believe. Imagine was released in September 1971. The title track reached #1 in multiple countries. It has since become one of the most recognized pieces of music ever recorded, played at vigils and memorials and moments of collective hope and grief on every continent, sung by children who cannot yet read, translated into dozens of languages, covered by hundreds of artists across every conceivable genre. It is, by any measure, John Lennon's most enduring artistic legacy. The vocal take at the center of it, the one recorded in a studio in New York in the late summer of 1971, the one with the slight roughness in the upper register, the one that sounds like a man coming back from somewhere quiet with something to say, was made possible by 3 days of silence that a woman arranged, protected, and held so that the man she loved could replenish what the world had been drawing from. Her name is Yoko Ono. She should have been credited as co-writer on the song. John said so himself years later and meant it. She was not. The credit line reads, John Lennon, but the voice on the recording knows. Listen for it, the grain in the sound, the specific texture of a voice that has been through something and is speaking from the other side of it. That texture is hers as much as his. She created the conditions for it. She held the space in which it became possible. That is what the invisible work looks like when it is done right. You cannot see it in the frame, but you can hear it in the song, and the song plays on. What does it mean to give someone their voice back? And what does it say about a world that watches the voice and never looks for what makes it possible? The answer is in the silence before the song. It always was.